evening here in Vancouver. Here in the West Coast, it is nice and sunny and warm, and we are so thankful that you chose to be here with us this beautiful sunny evening here in Vancouver. Welcome. And welcome to all of you who join us online from anywhere around the world you may be. My name is Pablo. I am a student here at Regent, and also this year's Evening Public Lecture Coordinator. If you have registered already to receive email updates, you know how relevant it is to be always up to date about what is happening here at Regent. Events and resources and lectures and everything that is happening here. If you have not registered, we will invite you to do so. All you have to do is to grab one of these blue cards that we have all the way to the back by the donations box. You can register digitally online, or you can just fill your information and drop it in the donations box. Before we start, we want to acknowledge that Regent College sits in the traditional and ceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam First Nation people. At this point, if you have any electronic device that may produce any sound, right now is the right time to put it on silent mode. We will really appreciate that. This is the time to put your electronic devices in silent mode, please. And lastly, for those of you who join us online, those of you who join us in person, please be reminded that we are recording and live streaming this event under the conditions spelled out in the public notice posted by the doors of Chapel and of Regent College. At this time, I would like to introduce Richard Thompson. He is a Director of Advancement here at Regent, and he will be our host tonight. Richard.
Thank you, Pablo, and allow me to add my welcome to Pablo's. Such a delight to see you here tonight with us, and an incredible delight for us to welcome back Dr. David Smith to Regent College for the 4th time. So welcome, good to have you here with us. I will more formally introduce him to you in a moment, but first let me just explain the format of the evening. For those who have been attending these for many years and hardly miss any, I know you're going to hear the same thing you hear week by week, but there are unfamiliar faces, so maybe this is your first time to an evening public lecture. After I introduce Dr. David Smith to us, he will then proceed to lecture for about 50 minutes or so. Following his lecture, we will have about 30 minutes for a question and answer period. For those that are gathered here in the chapel, we have microphones set up on either side of the auditorium, and we would invite you at that time to line up behind the microphones to ask your question. Please don't shout out your question from the seat. We want to make sure that it's done in an orderly way and through the microphone to make sure that everyone hears the question and that it is captured for the recording of tonight's lecture. For those who are online, you can submit a question at any time throughout the lecture. So as David Smith is lecturing, something grabs your attention or your imagination, just write out that question and email it to us at questions@regent-college.edu. That also applies to any that are gathered here. You have a question on your mind right at that moment, and you don't want to have to wait and get up and ask on the microphone. You can submit your question as well online, and then it will be read for you by Pablo. So that is the format for the evening, and we will look to conclude our evening right around 9 o'clock. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. David Smith, who I said is with us for the 4th time, and we are delighted to have you back. The last time he was here in person was just before the pandemic, 2018 or 2019, we were trying to remember. And then he did teach during our summer school in the pandemic, but of course, everything was fully online at that time. So really good to have you back here in the building, here in our chapel with us this evening. David is Professor of Education at Calvin University. He is the Director of the Kuyers Institute for Christian Teaching and Learning at Calvin. He's the coordinator of the Vries Institute for Global Faculty Development at Calvin University and senior editor of the International Journal of Christianity and Education. David, oh, I see. Are we missing? There it is. And I didn't touch anything. It came back. It's a miracle. Okay. I don't know if you captured all that. If you missed some of his credentials and you didn't hear me well enough, please come up and ask later. David earned his BA in Modern Languages at Oxford University, a postgraduate certificate in education from the University of Nottingham, a Master of Philosophy, an MPhil in Philosophy of Education and Philosophical Theology from the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, and a PhD in Education with a specialty in Curriculum Studies from the University of London. Trust I got all of that correct, David? David has written widely and worked extensively with educators at all levels of education, especially on questions of how faith relates to the practice of teaching. His book on Christian teaching was awarded the 2021 Lilly Fellows Program Book Award, a biennial award for work focused on teaching and scholarship in the Christian intellectual tradition. So we are very fortunate tonight to have an expert, if I can use that word, but certainly a well-educated, someone with great experience in this field of Christian education. And he is teaching this week, Everyday Christian Teaching, How Faith Shapes Pedagogy. That course began this morning. And I talked with a few of the students who are in his course, and they had a marvelous start. And I know that all of you here tonight are in for a real treat to hear Dr. David Smith. And with that, would you join me in giving him a very warm welcome?
Oh, good evening. How are you? Good. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being that strange kind of human being that willingly forgoes the beach in Vancouver in this kind of weather for a lecture hall focused on schooling. I'm thankful to Regent for the opportunity to do this again, to speak in public about things that matter. And I'm thankful to you for attending, because speaking's not much without hearing, and so you're an important part of what makes this work. I built this lecture around a few simple questions. The topic is the purposes of schooling, but I've structured it around some very simple questions. Here's the first question. The first question is, who? Or perhaps, who? Let's start with a quiz. I found this painting in a museum in the Netherlands. It's titled Heroes of the Reformation. So just take a moment to see how many individuals in this picture you can recognize. Perhaps you'd like to whisper your answers to a human being nearby. Okay, now if I help you out here, there's a few household names. If, like some of my students, you sort of know the broad strokes of the Reformation and you've heard the intro lecture, you can probably take a stab at Luther and Calvin, and you might have picked up Melanchthon if you've been listening especially carefully in the intro lecture. If you've taken a more active interest in Protestant history, you might be able to identify Zwingli and Huss. Once we start to get to Jerome of Prague and Gustavus Adolphus, we're getting into serious history buff territory. And if you actually identified either of those, you're probably feeling very pleased with yourself and a little smug at this moment. But we've still got a mystery guest. And interestingly, he's someone who is not frequently discussed in the English-speaking world as part of the Reformation. In fact, I suspect that very few around here would put him in their top 8 Reformation heroes for a painting to go in the foyer. In fact, when I ask Christian higher education faculty around North America if they've heard of him, it's rare to see more than 1 or 2 hands go up. And the painting's a little bit of an outlier, I'll confess, but it's not unique. Here's a lithograph from Alsace with the same title, Heroes of the Reformation, but with a more generous buffet of heroes of the Reformation. And I won't ask you to name all of these from memory. We've added not only Bucer and Wycliffe, but also Frederick the Wise and John the Steadfast. And once again, our mystery guest has a prominent place in the arrangement. There's a broad consensus that this was the same person who sat for an anonymous portrait by Rembrandt sometime around 1660. The painting is pretty quickly recognizable as a Rembrandt, but identifying the subject was the outcome of some academic detective work. In the early 1900s, he also became one of a handful of pivotal figures from Czech history painted by Alfons Mucha to adorn pillars in the municipal house in Prague, as well as getting one huge canvas to himself in a massive series of paintings of Slav history, also by Mucha. So his art history credentials are pretty good. If you'd grown up in the Czech Republic, you'd have a better chance of identifying him, because you would have seen his face regularly on postage stamps and daily on one of the banknotes. The source of the image on that stamp in the top left-hand corner will return much later in the lecture. You might even have heard Krček's Symphony No. 3, which is devoted to this person, or perhaps you just saw a cartoon of him on television. But if you're living in the English-speaking world, you might have had to adopt the more arcane strategy of reading the subtitle of tonight's lecture to guess the identity of our man of mystery. Of course, the images are all of Jan Amos Comenius, better known to the wider world as John Amos Comenius, a 17th century bishop and theologian in the Moravian Unity of Brethren, and a figure often described as the father of modern education. This lecture is about what Comenius thought schools were for. He was thinking about schools in the midst of significant social upheaval. He was born in 1592, and so he was in his 26th year, a young pastor, recently graduated, recently married, when the 30 Years' War broke out, close to where he lived. The consequences were devastating to the region and to him personally. He soon lost his wife and 2 small children in the plague that followed the fighting, and he found himself, like other Protestants in the area, required to convert to Catholicism or leave the region. After some time spent hiding out on friendly estates, he hiked with his congregation to Poland, a refugee. He spent the rest of his life in exile, though it was initial hopes of a possible return to Moravia that helped fuel his writing for schools. His initial works in Czech were directed to comforting his congregation and planning for a restoration of Moravian culture through improved schooling. As his reputation began to grow, his audience expanded, and he began to write in Latin. Komensky became Comenius. He was drawn into working with schools in Hungary and Sweden and spent time in England. He was asked to be president of Harvard College in America, but decided he didn't want to come over. The scope of his writing expanded from devotional and educational works into linguistics, political theory, literature, philosophy, and more. The ongoing critical edition of his collected works is projected to reach over 40 volumes. Yet his original vision of reforming schools remained a constant thread. Toward the end of his life, he wrote in a letter, "I never intended to write anything Latin, let alone to publish it. Early in my youth, I had the desire to compose some books in the mother tongue for the benefit of my nation, and this desire has not left me for 50 years. So he wrote in the first instance to serve a country to which he was never to return. And throughout his career, he also insisted that everything he had written, regardless of the topic, he had done so in his office as a theologian. His reception history has been tortuous. I missed my 30 Years' War slide, by the way, 30 Years' War image. His reception history has been tortuous. His theological emphases and belief in prophecy earned him disapproval from Enlightenment thinkers. His didactic works were later retrieved and celebrated by 19th and 20th century educators. Their tendency to focus on how well he anticipated educational ideas important to us now earned him the title the father of modern education, but also tended to sideline some of his own concerns. In the effort to appropriate him for modern schooling, his work on education has often been read with very little reference to his theology. Conversely, because he wrote a lot about education, and because a lot of his philosophical and broader works were lost for several hundred years, he's been given relatively little attention in theology and not studied much as a theologian. And it's not helped in the English-speaking world that a lot of his writing remains untranslated, and much of what has been translated is hard to find, and the translations are not always very accurate. In the hope of improving the situation just a little, I'm working on a new anthology of translations that should be out with Erdmann's sometime in early 2027. So if you're looking for Christmas ideas, like 2 Christmases from now, there's one for your list. Tonight, I'd just like to persuade you that he's a Christian thinker worth a little more airtime. and I'm going to focus in particular on how his theology shaped his ideas about what schools are for. Which brings us to the next question. Schools for whom? In both the Czech didactic, which he wrote first, and its later reworking in Latin as the Great Didactic, Comenius begins with reflections on what's special about human beings. In the first chapter of the Great Didactic, he has God address humanity as follows. I've appointed you to be my companion in eternity. For your use, I've prepared earth and heaven and what they contain. I appointed you over the works of my hands and placed everything under your feet, sheep and oxen and the beasts of the field, the fowl of the air and the fish of the sea, and crowned you with glory and honor. And finally, so that you would lack nothing, I gave you myself in a hypostatic union, joining my nature with yours in eternity, in a way granted to no other creature, visible or invisible. For which other creature in heaven or on earth can boast that God was manifested in its flesh and seen by angels? The Czech didactic, similar passage, is a little more explicit about the hierarchy of the arguments here. There he writes, humans are the most glorious beings, not only because they stand above all earthly creatures, or because divine wisdom created humans in its own image at the creation. That the same divine wisdom then took on the image of humanity when it wanted to transform corrupted humanity, that alone is the glory of which humanity can boast above all the angels. So yes, humans are given unique responsibility. Yes, humans are made in God's image. But Comenius insists that the ultimate ground for human worth is the incarnation. The hypostatic union of the divine and human natures of Christ eternally binds the divine to the human. If God has placed this degree of value on human nature, that he was willing to unite with it in order to rescue it, the logic is, how can we not invest in educating humans? How can we not invest in training and developing the gifts and abilities of humans if God places such value on human nature? Now, notice what a radical move this is, because if the fundamental reason for investing in education is the worth implied by the union of the human and divine natures in Christ, then the fundamental reason for investing in education has nothing to do with the accidents of your individual identity. God in Christ united himself with humanity, not with white folk, or clever people, or rich people, or gifted people, or able-bodied people, but with human nature. And Comenius makes this implication quite explicit. In the Pampaidia, a later work on education, he asks whether the blind, the deaf, or the mentally impaired should be considered worthy of inclusion in schooling. His answer, there is no exemption from human education except for non-humans. So if you're a squirrel, or a caterpillar, or a rock, you get to stay home. If you're human, you're included and worthy of an education. He writes of his educational plans at the start of the Pampaidia. First, the desire is for full formation into full humanity, not of any one individual, or a few, or many, but of all people and every individual, young and old, wealthy and poor, of high or low birth, men and women, in a word, of anyone who is born human, with the ultimate goal of the eventual restorative cultivation of the whole of humanity throughout every age level, social status, sex, or ethnicity. Now remember, he's writing this in the 1660s, right? Sounds a little like, almost like the 1960s, right? The incarnation happened for the salvation of the world. It placed value on humans as humans. And education is one of God's means for restoring human nature from its corruption. If the incarnation was not just for the sake of men, or the wealthy, or the strong, or the rich, then neither is education. Education is for humans. This pushes us to the next question. What are the human capacities that need to be restoratively cultivated? What do humans need to get better at? Comenius' answer to this is at first deceptively simple. But once we get into it, this is the part of the lecture that worries me a little. It's explored in such depth across so many of its writings that I can only try to summarize here while zooming in on a few details that I find particularly intriguing. So what are we educating for? Comenius not only affirmed a Trinitarian theology, but sought to weave conceptual echoes of the three-in-one nature of God throughout his accounts of human nature, society, creation, knowledge, schools, and more besides. In other words, he thought the nature of the Trinity was somehow woven into creation. So he looked for echoes of God's nature everywhere. He generated bewildering quantities of interconnected triads of ideas, not all of them easy to reconcile with one another. I'll note just a few here to give you a taste and put his ideas about the goals of learning in context. In Panegyrsia, or Universal Awakening, he announces an ambitious program for the reform of all human affairs. And he proposes that the three basic drivers of human affairs that need to be reformed are education, politics, and religion. He correlates these with God's wisdom, God's power, and God's goodness. He sees these three attributes reflected in the human image of God, in capacities for reason, will, and action, and describes the world in which humans are formed as a school, a kingdom, and a church. And three basic goals of formation are to become learned or knowledgeable, virtuous, and pious. And we could go on at great length. There are hundreds of these. But for now, I want to focus our attention on how he connects the wisdom, power, and goodness of God to these three goals of schooling, which are to get to know things, to become learned, to become virtuous, to be morally formed, and to become pious. And we'll think a bit more about what he means by that as we go along. So in the Great Didactic, let's think about this idea of, the three members of the Trinity as like three and one, like three but inseparable. We're going to see that reflected in a moment. In the Great Didactic, he describes the basic human needs that make schools necessary in this way. It is indeed clear that humans are positioned among the visible creatures with the plan that they should be 1, a rational creature, 2, a creature which is the Lord of creatures, and 3, a creature which is the image and joy of its creator. These three aspects are so united that at no time can any separation between them be admitted, for the basis of the present and the future life has its foundation in them. Now we can unpack this roughly as follows. Humans, more than any other creature, have an open-ended capacity for thinking. We like finding things out. It doesn't matter how many things we know, we get up the next day and want to know one more. We still doom scroll when we've read it all already. Doesn't matter how many things we think about or discover, there's room in our minds and appetites for more. Trying to keep us from thinking about things is like telling the tide to stop. We're driven to attend to other creatures, not just for immediate practical purposes of navigating around them, but through this more complex web of perceiving and naming and comprehending and classifying and remembering and pondering and organizing. In one place, Comenius calls us God's bookkeepers. We're the creatures who keep track of other creatures. If our powers of thought are not developed, our human potential, our human responsibility, and the richness of our relationship to the world are frustrated. So we're a rational creature, and that needs to be developed. But we're not detached observers or isolated thinkers. We're full participants in the world. We affect other people. We affect other creatures. We have power over their well-being. Human choices have a disproportionate impact. And human depravity harms other creatures. When a squirrel messes up, you most often just get a dead squirrel. When a human messes up, it can have much larger and more systemic consequences. Humans are prone to corruption and abuse. The rest of creation suffers as a result. That means that restorative cultivation can't just be training for the mind, because the mind and the will are connected. Education has to be fundamentally and pervasively moral in character, and education in virtue, because it has to reckon with the consequences of human power for the overall well-being of the world, a creature which is the Lord of creatures. But what frames the mind and the will? What sort of drives this concatenation of thinking and wanting? Our beliefs and commitments, our objects of reverence and our sources of joy. Those are the things that shape who we become. What we do with our power is rooted in what we do with our heart. So questions about power stand in the shadow of questions about where we find our center, where we find our source of purpose, where we find our delight. If we find this center in our own appetites and self-centered agendas, our own ambitions and desires, or within something material, we become, Comenius says, like an erratically spinning wheel with an off-center hub. Equilibrium demands that we find our center in the gift of God's delight in us and our delight in God. We're a creature that's the image and joy of its creator. Only then can we develop the virtues that might keep our understanding and choosing from being dangerous to ourselves and to other creatures. So reason, power, and delight are inseparable in their roots and in their effects. So Comenius goes on to say that from these three basic human characteristics, it follows that people have an inherent need to, one, be acquainted with all things, two, have power over things and themselves, three, to refer themselves and all things to God, the source of all. These three, if we want to express them in three common words, will be knowledge, virtue, or worthy morals, and religion or piety. So these are the three things that school has to be for, because they're integrated in the way human beings function. So because these three are inseparable, any kind of schooling that proceeds as if they're not connected is not, as far as Comenius is concerned, education. Learning, virtue, and piety are not goals that can be approached one by one. For example, by a science education that ignores faith and ethics, or a theological education that's divorced from study of the natural world, or an intellectual training that neglects ethical consequences. Back to the Pampidea. Our wish is that every human being should be rightly developed and perfectly educated, not in any limited sense, but in every respect that makes for the perfection of human nature, to know the truth and not be deluded by the false, to love the good and not be led astray by the evil, to do one's duty and avoid temptation, to speak wisely as need arises, on any subject and in any company, and never to be speechless. In short, dealing with material things and with men and with God. Schools, he thinks, should approach learning as inherently holistic. Now let's look just a little bit closer at that middle category of having power over other creatures. Comenius regularly mentions the dominion of humans over creation that he sees portrayed in Genesis 1, and he often does so in a familiar 17th century way that emphasizes human ownership of and freedom to use other creatures. Humanity is, he says, intended to govern the lower creatures themselves and their neighbor. In other words, he can sound a lot like the kind of early modern thinker that more recent ecological discussions have warned us against, out to exploit the earth for human benefit and heedless of the damage done to the world. And I'm not sure whether we can completely exonerate Comenius from being a child of his time on this score. Some of his metaphors do sound a little aggressive, but the matter's not so simple. When we see him talking about human power over creation, we have to ask ourselves how he's thinking about power. We're then reminded that human power is supposed to be an echo of God's power, a power that's used in love, preservation, and sustenance. Comenius is quite explicit that power used to destroy is not what he has in mind. The world is our schoolhouse, and it's meant to teach us love and delight. He puts it this way in The Great Didactic: when contemplating the world, we should be seized by admiration for the Creator, pushed onward in knowledge, and enticed to love through the dependability, beauty, and sweetness that were, to be sure, invisible and hidden in the abyss of eternity, now shining forth everywhere and offered to be touched, seen, and tasted. So this world is nothing other than our seed plot, our source of nourishment, our school. What are other creatures? Other creatures are an enticement to love. The rest of creation is there to tempt you into loving. In the Pampidea, he goes further, and articulates the stake that non-human creatures have in schooling. That all humans be developed toward a rational life is also a matter of concern to things themselves, so that they too might be better under the wise direction of wise people. Things are better under humans who justly possess and use them, if they know how to use them fittingly. It's notable what Solomon says: the just man also cares for the life of his beast of burden, but the wicked man is cruel. Oh, how great is the cruelty that all things, everywhere, experience through the wickedness or ignorance of humans who use them illicitly. He continues, the apostle pointed to this, testifying that all creatures are subjected to vanity and sigh, desire, and hope to be liberated from such wicked servitude. It's certainly desirable that what creatures long and hope for should be pushed forward, and everything everywhere should proceed more justly, and all creatures should have cause to praise God with us. Therefore, it's also desirable that all people be taught to know and understand things rightly, and to use and enjoy things rightly. For without the cultivation of dispositions, this has never been brought into existence, nor will it ever be. In other words, if you leave humans to be ignorant, they tend to wreck things. But if humans get the right kind of education, maybe the horses will be happier. So cultivating human dispositions is necessary because the problem is not just lack of understanding. It's a misdirected will and a misplaced delight. And these are inseparable. You can't pull them apart. Power without virtue becomes destructive. If all creatures are to be able to praise God with us, then schooling has to help foster in humans the disposition of approaching them with love as an enticement to care. So what we might today call environmental education, and this to me is a fairly radical implication of what Comenius is saying here, environmental education can't actually be a subject in the curriculum on this view, or part of the natural sciences, or a special topic. It's a big part of the reason why we have schools, on Comenius's account. And in fact, he makes the interests of non-human creatures part of his argument for universal schooling. The need for universal education is obvious, he says, if we attend to how God, humans, and things themselves have a stake in it. When we debate schools in our community, I wonder how often we think about God and non-human creatures having a stake in how we shape the school, rather than just the people having a stake in how the school is shaped. But for Comenius, that's part of why we need schools. If you actually think about what would lead to God's delight, to the well-being of the wider world, and to human beings thriving, it's pretty obvious, says Comenius, that you need some good schools. He says that we won't make any headway unless we reflect on why we are here and why other creatures are here with us, and unless we consider the conditions that might lead to divine, human, and creational delight. And this brings us back to that third area, focused on piety, on being the creatures that God delights in, the image and joy of God. Now remember earlier when we looked at a few of Comenius's myriads of triads. And think about the right column for a minute. Why, we might reasonably wonder, is the human capacity for action, second one from the bottom there, in the same conceptual bucket as church, piety, and delight? The answer to that is not simple, but here's an important part of it. Comenius sees schooling as oriented to action towards the world, not just towards theoretical understanding. It can't just be an education of the mind. It has to be an education that affects how we engage the world, how we act. In fact, in the Great Didactic, he offers the principle that's often quoted out of context, that when anything is taught, the teacher should, quote, at the same time teach its practical application in everyday life. Right? You should never teach anything without teaching the practical application, he says. But when he says practical, he doesn't mean quite what a modern materialistic culture might mean by that. When we talk about everything has to be practical, we tend to mean material processes, economic processes, being able to balance your checkbook and change a light bulb and that kind of thing. That's not quite what he means. Remember, earlier on, he says you've got to be able to deal with human beings and God and creatures. Practical means things that are going to help you live well. So prayer is pretty practical if God in fact exists. because it's one of the things you need to know how to do to navigate through life. So being practical means knowing how to deal wisely with God, with other people, and with other creatures, so that you might be able to live life well. A practical education is an education for wisdom that's lived out amid the core relationships that shape humans. And that in turn relates to our status as images of God. In the Panegyricia, Comenius says that though personal salvation is a proper thing for the individual to be concerned about, salvation does not just mean the rescue of souls. It's also about the restoration and protection of the whole of creation. And it's false to think of that larger task as God's problem, because God chooses to work in and through humans, his images. Comenius explains, in one of his more uncompromising passages, one should argue that if anything is God's concern, it must be shared by us, since we are the image of God. Will you please step in front of a mirror? In it, you will see an exact reflection of yourself and your every gesture. Humanity is meant to be the image of God. Do you see that God is good? You also must endeavor to be good. Do you see God distributing his goodness? You must do the same. Do you see him inviting people to share his goods? You must do likewise. Do you see him acting to preserve his creatures from ruination? You must either accept the need to do the same or renounce your claim to be the living image of God. Let that last sentence or two sit for a moment. Like, either care for creatures or admit that you're not the image of God. This is where he ends up here. Now, I wonder if by now you're starting to sense all the connective threads that I'm trying to weave for you here. The human capacity for action is part of humans imaging God, who is omnipotent. He's the perfect agent. Right? So God acts, God does things, God can do all things. Humans also act because we're in the image of God. But God's also good, so human actions have to be good actions if humans are functioning properly. And God's actions are directed to the preservation of his creatures. So human actions should also be directed to the preservation of creatures. Human actions should have the same quality as God's actions. And piety, then, doesn't just mean going to church. It means obediently taking up the responsibility to live as God's image. Using our capacity for action in a way that reflects God's good agency. And that in turn means we've got to grow in understanding and formation in virtues, because ignorant and wicked actions do not image God, who does not do ignorant and wicked things. You see how this all keeps circling round and round? And that in turn only makes sense if we make God himself the center of the process. So these three things, learning, virtue, and piety, are inseparable, and action, delight, church, faith, imaging God are all kind of connected. So action and piety are overlapping concepts, because acting for the good means imaging God. And that's explicitly tied to an overarching emphasis on hope. Comenius, living in exile amid a brutal 3-decade-long war, which started when he was 26 and finished when he was 56, and during which he buried multiple wives, children, and friends, he knew better than many that the world is violent, deceptive, and cruel. So he's not painting a romantic picture of how everything's lovely here. And yet he repeatedly returns to the conviction that despite everything, God wills good for the world, and we should act as if God wills good for the world. God is restoring the world, and God wants to work through his creatures. And that implies action. If we're inspired by this hope, he says, let us investigate ways of fulfilling it. By promoting the common good of mankind, let us be ministers of the goodness of God. And being ministers of goodness is not about grim determination to do the right thing out of a sense of duty. It's more about learning to delight in the good, because that kind of delight is proper to our nature and it's essential to our relationship with God. In fact, in the Great Didactic, Comenius says that the purpose of human existence is to serve God, creatures, and ourselves, and to enjoy the delight that God, creatures, and we ourselves disclose. I've loved this passage for a long time. It has taught me that when I'm doing the washing up and I pause and I look out of my kitchen window and I see the evening light in the leaves of the willow tree in my backyard, and I just enjoy it, that I'm not taking time out from being productive. I'm being wise. I'm fulfilling my creative purpose by delighting in the beauty that God placed in creation that was there to entice me to love through its sweetness, order, and dependability. It took me a long time to figure out where he got this from, but he takes it from Proverbs chapter 8, which talks about a personified wisdom that was there at creation. I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep, and it goes on. But it finishes, then I was constantly at his side. I, wisdom, was constantly at God's side. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world, and delighting in humankind. Wisdom in Proverbs 8 has a threefold delight. Wisdom delights in God, delights in creation, and delights in people. So if you want to be wise, figure out how to delight in God, how to delight in creation, and how to delight in people. And if you want to build schools that teach people to be wise, then figure out how to build schools that help people to delight in God, to delight in people, and to delight in creation. So creation is shaped by a divine wisdom that itself delights in God, in humans, and in other creatures. And humans, as God's images within creation, become wise by learning to delight in God, in other people, and in creatures. So back to our original question. Let's try to sum up a little. What are schools for? So why then? Why schools? Crazy idea. Putting all these kids together in a place and trying to change them. Why do that? Well, we get this wrong, says Comenius, if we start thinking about career or success or financial betterment as the core goals of schooling. He puts it this way in the Panorthosia. Most schools exist for show or profit or the quest for some form of entertainment from knowledge of literature and material things. Bernard of Clairvaux has observed that most wish to know for the sake of knowing, which he describes as base inquisitiveness, or for the sake of becoming known, which he calls base vanity, or for the sake of selling their knowledge for money or honors, which he calls base profiteering. How base indeed to exploit God's noble gift of wisdom as a device for making money. You can hear the disdain dripping from his mouth as he articulates this. How dare you? He says, take God's gift of the world as this enticement to love and think that it was mostly about getting ahead or getting richer. So thinking about schools as primarily the gateway to a career or entry into the halls of influence is, he thinks, fundamentally wrong. Schools, he goes on to say, are for salvation. Not just in the narrow sense of individual religious well-being or souls going to heaven, but in the wider sense of creation's restoration from its ruin. Because humans are built on the plan of God's wisdom, power, and goodness, primed to think, to will, and to act, schooling has to be designed to fit humans. It can't treat humans as inanimate objects, to be carved or manipulated or coerced. He wrote a lot about seeking a fundamentally non-violent form of schooling, in which students are not treated as objects that you can force into a certain shape. Schooling exists to develop the capacity to think wisely, to grow in the virtues, to gain the skills needed to use your power in non-destructive ways, and to develop a capacity for obedient delight in God and creation, to be ministers of goodness. Now, one of the many things that make Comenius stand out in the history of the Protestant churches is the degree to which he not only formulated a sophisticated and profound theology of education, but sought to work it out into the details of pedagogical practice. He actually wrote a lot of textbooks. And there's a wealth of territory to explore in terms of how he extended these ideas into textbook design, the role of play and learning, special education, advice on parenting, school structure, disciplinary practices, and more. If you have another 4 hours, we could maybe scratch the surface, but there's probably not time for all of that tonight. So let me bring things to a close in a different way. Sorry, my screen blanked on me there for a moment. Here we go. So as with any thinker from almost 400 years ago, it's difficult to embrace Comenius' ideas wholesale. There are plenty of topics on which he's working with the knowledge of his day, and therefore with ideas that have turned out to be flat out mistaken. In that respect, he's no different from us. His relentless effort to fit everything into threes, in a kind of cosmic Trinitarianism, leads into some significant insights, but also breaks down, even for him, whenever it becomes apparent that there might actually be 4 or 5 things that really ought to be considered. His understanding of the proper purpose of creatures is rooted in an Aristotelian cosmology that seems problematic from today's vantage point. So I'm not advocating for swallowing Comenius whole. But I do think that his lifelong effort to think theologically about education led him to more nuanced and interesting questions about faith and schooling than most other Christian thinkers have managed. And I find for myself that thinking about those questions with him helpfully provokes my own thinking about the teaching and learning with which I'm involved. So let me finish with 2 examples from my own classroom. I turn first to a college class for students training to be teachers that I taught just this past spring. We spent some time exploring how virtues and vices impact the actions and perceptions of learners and teachers. How much of your behavior in the classroom is driven by fear or pride? How much of it's driven by humility and gratitude? And we talked about how our cultural bent toward efficiency and control and social acceleration undermines our attention to the shape of our hearts. I assigned students to choose a tree, to observe it for at least 10 minutes, and to journal about what happened. That was it. This is not a conventional homework. In fact, one student reported telling his friends about the homework and being advised by them that the task was stupid and that he should pretend that he'd done it and make up the journal entry. Thankfully, he decided to go ahead and do it anyway. Another student, though, wrote this, one of many complex reactions that I received in students' journals. The things the tree was feeling, I was also feeling. So the wind, the cold, some of the drizzle. I was thinking about how round the trunk was and how old the tree must be. And then it got me thinking about how much this tree has seen in its lifetime. It's behind my rental house, so I was thinking of all the people it's seen come and go and live in the house. How I'm just an occupant of it for 2 years, and then more girls will come and live after me. And something about that idea of time and how much it's seen almost made me respect the tree in a way, which is weird for me to say. Just knowing how many, storms it must have survived makes it seem strong. And the idea of its strength is something that I respect. The whole concept of me respecting a tree still seems a little weird, and it's hard to articulate it. But I feel like from now on I will have this kind of weird connection with this one tree in my backyard that seems unique to our relationship, if you can even call it a relationship. I kind of love this journal. Setting aside the currently controversial question of how much trees perceive, a more complex question than one might think, I see here a student wrestling with the new and uncomfortable question of whether it's appropriate to respect trees, to respect bits of creation that until now have been taken for granted as background objects. You see an uncertainty about what kind of language might be appropriate to a new awareness of connection to another creature that's tinged with admiration and an odd sense of responsibility. The word weird comes up 3 times. She's not quite sure how to name it. This thought process tugs at the student's conceptual framework. There's some hard thinking going on, but it also touches on their sense of ethics and their sense of responsibility and their capacity to contemplate and care for the creatures around them. I think it's the kind of learning moment that Comenius might want us to look out for as students go about their learning. My second example connects to my career as a language teacher. Comenius wrote the most famous language textbook in history, the Orbis Sensualium Pictus, the world of sensory things in pictures. It went through almost 250 editions across a 300-year lifespan, starting in 1658. That's a better shelf life than any textbook that you have used will have. It begins with a grand tour of the creatures that students might encounter. Humans do not become the focus until chapter 36. There are 6 chapters on birds, each placing a different cluster of birds within their natural environment. We have birds, waterfowl, ravenous birds, birds that haunt the fields and woods, and more. The text beneath the pictures describes some of their behaviors, the beauty of their song, and how they find food. Now fast forward to Deutsch heute, a popular recent German textbook. The word bird appears in the glossary, but we learn the names of no specific kinds of bird. The only bird images I can find in the book are cartoon pictures of a penguin in a fridge and chickens behaving as tourists. The absence seems both haunting and oblivious when we reflect that long-term surveys in North America show, and I'm quoting, a net loss of 2.9 billion birds across all biomes, a reduction of 29% since 1970. Birds are just an example. More broadly, there are almost no verbal or visual representations of non-human creatures in the entire book. We learn languages for shopping, for going on vacation, for navigating trains and airports and hotels, not for talking about other creatures. The teacher's edition of Contacte, another current German textbook, explains that the chapter titled Possessions and Pleasures is about, and I quote, the student's immediate environment outside of class, which, it goes on to say, consists of the things they have, the things they would like to have, and what they like to do. I'm not making this up. This is a current German textbook's definition of the student's environment. Things they have, things they would like to have, and things they like to do. The gulf between this account of the student's environment and Comenius' picture of the purposes of schooling is stark and I think not particularly flattering to the present. And since we visited the Orbis Pictus, let's finish there. The first page of the Orbis Pictus, Comenius' famous language textbook, offers us an image of a child and a teacher standing by a road. Behind the child are dark clouds and tangled bushes, the sin, ignorance, and mortality of unformed human nature, default humans. But the child has started on a journey and is politely removing his hat and pointing to his ear to show a willingness to listen and learn, showing that he's already made some progress at home before going to school. The teacher, with his robe of intellectual authority and his staff of moral authority, points to rays of light coming over his shoulder, the restorative light of God entering the learning process in collaboration with a human teacher. Learning is a process that unites the robe, the staff, and the light. Reason, virtue, and piety, intellectual, moral, and spiritual formation. And the child's path takes a sharp left turn between the teacher's staff and robe before heading to the entrance to the town, where the child is to take up a life of service to his community after being formed in the necessary understanding, dispositions, and capacity for action. The text under the picture, the text that introduces the book, is a dialogue. It says, "Come, child, learn to be wise." "What is that?" the child replies. "To be wise." "To understand rightly, to act rightly, and to speak rightly, all that is necessary." "Who will teach me this?" "I, with God." Thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you for listening. Thank you for teaching. And thank you for introducing us to this previously not well-known but very important individual, Comenius. we will now have a time of Q&A. Again, by way of reminder, there are microphones on either side of the auditorium, so please proceed there if you have a question. And again, for our online audience, or for those who are sitting here with your silent phones, you can type out a question and email it to us at questions@regent-college.edu. I don't see anyone yet at the microphone, and I don't know if we have an online question. So, David, maybe I'll ask you one. And perhaps I missed it, and I know that this was not a comprehensive representation of all that Comenius thought and wrote, but a word that I was looking for that I did not see was grace. He speaks of God's goodness, of God's wisdom, and I just wondered about his concept of grace, especially with this amazing, intriguing quote that we ought to be living lives that image God or renounce our claim to be the living image of God. Where does the fact that we always fall short, fail, how is his understanding of God's grace in the midst of that call to be the living image of God?
Yeah, I mean, first in terms of general background, he was part of the Moravian Brethren. He was a bishop with them. He always considered himself an Orthodox part of the Moravian Brethren, and the Moravian Brethren at the time were classified among the Reformed churches. They were like a hair's breadth from the Reformed churches. They didn't quite like double predestination, and they weren't too keen on using the state's power to punish heretics. But other than that, their doctrines of salvation, of grace, of sin and repentance, and so on were pretty much what you'd find in Reformed churches, and that's pretty much where he is, right? He doesn't write about that a ton, because when he's writing about a lot of these other things, he's trying to define action in the world and how we build schools and so on and so forth. But occasionally he'll step back and say, well, yeah, of course, it's obvious that you can do nothing without God. I mean, that's sort of, he's just taking that as read. You know that, right? But he's often sort of driven by this this really strong desire to say to the people around him, yeah, but, God wants to make it better. God wants to work through you. God wants to change things. So yes, he doesn't, this is another thing where he's a little different from some of the, the theologians of the Reformation who spent their time primarily hashing out big doctrines of grace. He doesn't spend a lot of his writing doing that. He just occasionally appeals to it in pretty orthodox ways.
Okay. Wonderful. Glad to hear that. We have a question up here, please.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was very informative. I have kind of two questions. One is, how were children educated before Comenius? And it seems like the focus is on teaching children, and yet there needs to be erupted from this, an entire infrastructure to teach teachers, so teacher education, and of course, school buildings and sort of the explosion of the economy of education?
Yeah. He was tremendously ambitious in his vision. He tried to write about everything. So he's got his theory of education explicitly goes from birth through death. So he wrote a book on early childhood parenting. He's like a very early proponent of early childhood education. And he's also talking about lifelong learning and adult education, and he works the stages out with sort of elementary, secondary, higher education. He's starting to try to systematize all of that. So he's certainly trying to think about all of the different levels of that. A lot of his interventions, because of the places where he got invited into reform schools, were at the elementary and secondary level, in Sweden and Hungary especially. But he was also invited to England to consult in the early stages of the Royal Society about setting up higher education. In fact, one of the other things he's known for is his advocacy of what he called colleges of light, which were basically going to be kind of interdisciplinary, international research centers. So he was trying to think about higher education structures that would be actually international and interdisciplinary as well. And that's certainly part of his vision of where educators might come from. So he's got his finger in all of this. This is why the collected volumes are going to be more than 40. The collected writings are going to be more than 40 volumes. What were schools like before him? Like a lot of people around then writing about schooling, he says some colourful things about what schooling's like. There's one place, I can't do the whole thing from memory, but there's one place where he says something like, to be in school, you need lead buttocks and an iron skull and a gold purse and a brain of mercury. And the lead buttocks are so that you can endure sitting down all the time, and the iron skull is so that when the teacher beats you, you'll endure the process, and the purse of gold is going to cost you, right? So yeah, we're still in an era where he's advocating for universal schooling at a time when that's not a given. Not everybody gets to go to school. Those that do get to go to school, there's a lot of physical punishment. Traditional parts of the curriculum, we're still at the tail end of a phase where there's just a lot of memorization of ancient texts in Latin and getting beaten if you get it wrong. Comenius was a big advocate of teaching the mother tongue first and aiming for students to understand things before they're asked to parrot them. He says students are not parrots, they're images of God. So yeah, I mean, like everything, it varied, right? There were schools that were better than other schools, but one of the reasons he became very famous very quickly in the mid part of his career was because what he was advocating seemed to people like such a big improvement on the kind of teaching that was going on at the time, which was often very rote, somewhat violent, and not always terribly interesting. So, yeah.
Please.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Everything you're saying really deeply resonates with me as a teacher. I'm just wondering, with everything that you're talking about here, his sort of like pedagogy and everything that he's talking about is very, steeped in the context of Christendom.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, how do we, maybe as teachers today, and I myself as a public school teacher, how can we take some of this amazing wisdom that he's talking about and put it into our practice if we're limited by, working and serving in a very post-Christian context?
Oh, we need a week for that question. Where to start? One of the things that's sort of intriguing about Comenius is that, like I said briefly in passing, one of the ways he's been appropriated actually is as an early advocate of universal education. So he was used a lot by the Soviet education system because of his emphasis on equality, right? All kinds of human beings get to be educated. He was seen as quite a big hero for Soviet education theory, but they tended to edit out all of his theology. In fact, I once taught a seminar in Ukraine with some teachers who all knew who Comenius was. They'd all studied him in their teacher education, and they didn't know he was Christian. That's actually tough to pull off because he doesn't hide it for more than a couple of paragraphs. So there's this one appropriation of Comenius that has actually been for public schools, right, rather than for like Christian schooling in this modern sense. And yet the way he's thinking about universal education, he is also assuming a Christian framework. So he's writing at a time when those things haven't been pulled apart yet. Right? They're still together, which actually means appropriating him now has to be a little bit creative. So let me take a really quick stab. Because he's asking these big questions about human formation, because he's asking you to think of the learning that you provide as always intellectual, moral, and spiritual formation, even if you're not quoting Bible verses, even if you're not praying in class. So this is not just about having a religious bit in your curriculum or saying a Christian thing. That's not what he means by spiritual formation, necessarily. Right? There are times and places for that. But he's inviting you more to a way of seeing your students and a way of seeing what learning is for. So can you design forms of learning that aren't just about putting information into your students' heads or getting them through the exams or helping them get into the right college, but invite them into this kind of more holistic reflection on who they are and how they're growing and how they relate to the people around them and how they're going to relate to the world, and to ask big questions about how that hangs together and why am I put in the world and why are the other things there and how am I supposed to treat them. A lot of that is already pushing in Comenius' direction, even if you don't throw in the Bible verse at the end of the hour. And Comenius is comfortable with that in the Orbis Pictus, I'm very struck by the chapter on pottery in the Orbis Pictus, which doesn't have the verse about I am the potter and you are the clay, and it just teaches you about pottery. Right? So there's this sense that the faith component is what funds everything. It's not necessarily the flag that gets waved at the end of the class. So in that sense, I actually think there's a lot of potential to unpack him in a secular educational context, but longer conversation needed. So, yeah.
Our friend up here is next.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how his ideas were received, given some of what you've presented seemed a little bit ahead of their time. The concept of educating everyone regardless of social status, women, children, high, low income, disabled people, like how were those ideas received by the people of his time?
It was received in many different ways. And in fact, sometimes in the same time and place. So, for instance, he was invited to reform an important school in Hungary, and then after a while got into a major conflict with some of the existing leaders there, who didn't like some of what he was doing and thought there was too much play and so on, and he sort of ended up losing his support there and having to move on. So there were positive and negative reactions, sometimes even in the places where he was directly working. Among people who were trying to think about the reform of schooling, he became quite famous and quite highly regarded. In his day, he was a major figure, but it wasn't always popular on the ground. He was accused of heresy a couple of times and had to go back and defend himself before his synod. That what he was doing wasn't this departure from Orthodox Christianity. So some people really, reacted to his writing in quite negative ways. So there was a whole swathe of different reactions. There were even times when he was having to change his travel plans for fear of being attacked on his way from one place to another, because those were just the times he lived in. Like I said, after he died, then really mixed reactions again. Some of his stuff was just buried for a long time. Some of it was literally lost for 300 years and recovered a long time later. So the reactions have been very, very varied, both in his day and in the subsequent centuries. Some people loved it, some people really didn't, which, I don't know, sounds like now, doesn't it?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Smith. So we touched on the subject of not turning education into a product for becoming rich, for making money, and by principle, I agree with that. At the same time, we are in a reality, and particularly for us who are in Christian higher ed, where we all face the reality of accepting students, having students even sign up for our courses, for our institutions. Why is this institution twice as expensive as the other one? And therefore, the language oftentimes easily turns into because the product we sell, or whatever synonym we use, is better than the other. How can we redeem this language and still be able to face the reality of the financial situations that we are in?
Yeah. Not all of the financial situations are redeemable, I suspect. In other words, some of our models of education might not actually be sustainable in the long haul. So there's possibly some design problems there. But in terms of the ideas, I think part of what he wants us to do, if he were looking at us, would be to say, expand the envelope in terms of how we think about it. So come back to this idea of everything needs to be practical. And being practical means wisdom for living well. Now, that doesn't exclude not making foolish financial decisions, all right? So you do need to take into account that part of living well is being able to eat, being able to provide for your family, not having crippling debt, right? Those kinds of things. That's part of wisdom. It's just that that's not necessarily the whole or the leading part of wisdom. Wisdom is also knowing how to live well with God. It's knowing how to live well with the people around you. It's knowing how to live well with animals and birds and so on, right? So there's this more holistic sense of what a good outcome might mean for your ability to thrive. So that doesn't exclude thinking about the financial piece, but it means that the financial piece can't be the dominant story as to why we're doing it. Right? The point of the learning wasn't just the economic outcome, but that doesn't mean the economic part is not a thread in there somewhere. So conceptually, that would be sort of where I'd put it, I think, in his schema. That, of course, doesn't solve the practical issue of whether we've built models of education that are increasingly too expensive and have to do some more creative thinking, but that's another question. But asking yourself real questions about, whether studying this expense for this many years is really going to help me serve God in my community and stay alive and so on. Those are all questions that he wouldn't mind you asking at all. So,
Excellent question. Thank you. Pablo, you have an online question.
Yes, we actually have 3 online questions. The first one comes from Kathy. She has a question related to technology, particularly AI. And Kathy asks...
Comenius wrote a lot about that.
Kathy asks, well, acknowledging as you have that Comenius is a product of his time and faced different challenges and assumptions, how might Comenius' views or thoughts help speak into some of the particular challenges and opportunities of technology in education, particularly with the increasing prevalence of AI technologies?
Yeah, believe it or not, I'm actually trying to write a paper right now on Comenius and AI. He didn't write about it directly, but he was relatively early in the history of printing technology. And he loved books, and he loved what printing could do, but he also writes very warily about some of the downsides of printing technology for learning. He says, before long, we're going to have way too many books, and we won't be able to tell what's true, because there'll be just so much stuff. And people are going to start buying books and just looking things up in the index instead of actually thinking their way through the whole argument. And we're going to end up with people who just kind of like get the information without actually going through the formative process and don't become wise. They just become people who can look stuff up. And this sounds kind of contemporary, doesn't it? Right? It's, so it is interesting to me that when he comes to that, the questions that he consistently asks are, how is this affecting our formation? How is this affecting the kind of human beings we turn into? So where I started making the connection here was this past semester. I was teaching a course called The Christian Teacher for education students. And in the first week of class, I emphasized passionately that every week I was going to ask my students to write journals about how they were thinking about faith and education as a result of what we were discussing in class. And I said, the point of these journals is not for you to summarize what's in the readings, and it's not for you to say what you think I want to see. I want to see your thinking. I want to see the questions you're asking. I want to, like, if I can see you wrestling with it, that's what you're going to get credit for. I've already read the readings. I don't need a summary of them. And I sort of laid this on as thick as I could, and I got in the first set of journals, and 5 of them were written by AI. In a course on how to be a Christian teacher, after talking about how much I wanted to see their thoughts, and I almost quit. But then I started thinking about, there's more than one direction as a teacher that I can go in right here. So I could have gone down the disciplinary route. There are mechanisms for that in my university. I could have reported this as academic dishonesty. It would have triggered a whole disciplinary process. But the more I looked at these particular journal entries, the more I came to the hypothesis that the students concerned were not trying to cheat. They were students who were struggling with the academic process in various ways, who had tried to use an assistive technology the same way that somebody who doesn't spell well might try to use a dictionary, and they had used it clumsily. So they'd ended up just taking chunks out of the AI, and it was obvious that it wasn't their style, and so on. And so instead, my reaction was to pull them in one by one and have a conversation with them about their formation. Right? That, you know, if you do this every week through the semester, how much wisdom are you going to gain as a teacher by the end of the semester? And I tried to make that the ongoing conversation. And it's always hard to know for sure, but I believe that we made significant headway. I didn't see those students again using AI to replace their own writing. Now, I'm not saying that's a magic bullet or anything, but that, I think, is how Comenius would want us to approach. I talk to a lot of teachers who the response to AI is, how do I keep my students from cheating? Right? How do I stop? And I'm seeing teachers try all these tricks to kind of prevent students from using AI with the homework. I think Comenius would say, if that's just a way of controlling your students, that might not be the right way to go. You actually need to develop enough of a relationship with your students that you can convince them that their formation is at stake. Because there's been stories about universities doubling down on control mechanisms where you use software to detect whether students are using AI, and that software gives you false positives, so you've now got students being falsely accused of using AI, especially if they're neurodivergent or English as a second language speakers, because their prose is not quite standard prose, and so the software... So you start generating this whole new round of problems. Is it possible to step out of that and have a conversation about wisdom, I think, is the question Comenius would ask. I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's the question you would ask.
Second question.
Thank you. Yes, the second question comes from Paul, and he has a question related to higher education institutions. He asks, what do you make of much of the current critiques around higher education institutions, particularly the indictment of the Ivy Leagues in the United States? They are producing intellectually homogeneous robots instead of free-thinking individuals. Do you see this as a legitimate critique and the existential crisis is often posed to be?
Yeah, I don't know. I have an inherent mistrust of diatribes. I think, any sort of sweeping account of what's wrong with higher education is going to be a massive overgeneralization. I'm sure there are lots of really smart, really careful people coming out of the Ivy Leagues, and I'm sure there are lots of people in the Ivy Leagues who are teaching them incredibly well. So I've got a real hesitation about these kind of broad brush, woe is those people over there kind of ways of talking about education. Does that mean everything is well with higher education? Probably not. Here's the kind of problem with higher education that sort of upsets me. There was a story a few years ago that left me angry for months in the Chronicle of Higher Education, where somebody was describing what they said to their students at the start of the school year, and they thought this was a noble thing to say to their students at the start of the school year. They said what they tell their students is, you're in higher education now, and I'm a professor. That means I have no responsibility whatsoever for whether you learn or not. You better get used to the idea that whether you pass or fail now is up to you. I get paid regardless. And I've spent years studying, so I get to talk about the stuff that I know, and I'm going to do that. And if you want to keep up and make notes, that's your business. But nobody's going to hold your hand. And this was presented as this really, kind of tough love, kind of noble sort of narrative, and I was mad about that for months. Just this sort of abdication of responsibility for the effect that you're having on the people in your care. And I do think higher education in North America at times sustains that kind of narrative, right? The students are like the great unwashed they will learn or they don't. The professors are there to do their noble thing, and if some of the barbarians learn, then great. That I find a deeply poisonous narrative, and you do occasionally run into it. But I don't have any right to say what the Ivy Leagues are doing. I haven't sampled 5,000 of their graduates.
And Pablo, there was one more online question?
Yes, it is, indeed. And this question comes from Why. It's related to the term practical, as in practical education. She asks, according to what you have just shared, it seems to me that the way contemporary schooling system is organized is not practical enough.
Yeah.
If that is the case, what impacts it may have on the current role of teachers?
Yeah. Again, I go back to really concrete things here. I trained as a language teacher. I taught German, French, Russian, and ESL for my first 6 years in teaching. To 11 to 16-year-olds. And all of the textbooks I used boasted that they were really practical. Right? That was how they'd been designed. They were trying to be as practical as possible. And so practical meant teaching you the French and the German you needed when you went on vacation to France and Germany. Right? That's practical, right? If you go to Germany, you're going to need to be able to buy food. So we need to do lots of food shopping dialogues and cafe dialogues and restaurant dialogues. And you're going to have to buy train tickets, so we did railway station dialogues. And you're going to have to check into hotels, so we did hotel dialogues, right? That was what it meant to be practical. Practical was the needs of the tourist. If you dial your way back a couple of centuries to 1711, another really successful language textbook, The London Vocabulary by James Greenwood. In the preface to the book, he boasts at great length about everything in the book is practical. He's thrown out all of the vocabulary you don't need, and this is just the practical stuff. It's only the words that you're going to need for reading Roman authors. It's practical because it's going to help you read the classics. You go back to 1658 and look at the Orbis Pictus, and Comenius talks in the introduction about how practical the Orbis Pictus is, because he's included everything you need for navigating the world wisely, for learning how to relate to other creatures and to God and to the people around you. pretty much every textbook ever has said that it's practical, and it's actually quite revealing. I think it can be a useful question to ask yourself, when you say learning should be practical, what do you mean? Like, practical for what? What diagnosis does that give you about what you think life is about? So my bottom line implication for teachers is that teachers ought to get more used to asking themselves that question: practical for what? How do I imagine the future of my students? What do I think is needed for their life? Is it really just this kind of skills, or are there other things that are going to be going on that they need to be preparing for? And have some conversations about that, and then try to figure out what's missing from your curriculum. It's another long story, but eventually I started working with other language teachers, and we started trying to design teaching units that were interviews with elderly ladies telling their life stories, because maybe one of the practical things you need is to be able to listen to the elderly. Maybe that's practical, right? So just to open up that question and see what happens. Yeah.
If there are no further questions, we'll draw our evening to a close. But if there is one person with that one last pressing question, now's the time to make your way to the microphone. If not, I would want to say first to our audience, thank you for your presence and your participation, and for your very excellent and thoughtful questions this evening. Thank you, David, for your very practical answers. In the best sense of the word, because you are helping us navigate our way through life and understanding education with wisdom. So we deeply appreciate that. Also want to say a practical thank you to our donors and our supporters who make it possible for us to host these evening lectures throughout this summer and every summer of Regent's existence. Speaking of supporters, if you care to be one of those that helps us continue to offer these lectures, on your way out there's a donation box. If you are one of those people that still has cash on you, you can make a little donation there, or you can go online to rgnt.net/give. Do want to remind everyone that this lecture and all of the lectures this summer will be available on our YouTube channel. Tonight's lecture won't be available, as soon as you get out of here, but within the next 24 hours, you'll find it on our YouTube channel. And all of our lectures from this summer, the spring and summer, you'll find on our YouTube channel until the end of August. So, make use of that. Forward the link to our YouTube channel to friends who you might want to say, you should listen to this excellent lecture by David Smith. And then in closing, before I thank David formally at the end, I do have 3 announcements. And as with Comenius, there are 3 of them. I don't know how intertwined they all are, but I do think they all help us live wisely and worship well. Number 1, join us tomorrow morning at 11:45 right here if you are local and wish to join us for our chapel time, 11:45 right here in the chapel. Join us Wednesday, the day after, at 12 noon in room 100, just right across from our chapel, for a roundtable conversation with Amy Brown Hughes and David De Silva on the topic of early Christianity. And then third, we invite you back here 1 week from tonight, Monday, July 21st at 7:30, when Jonathan Pennington will be our guest lecturer speaking on children of the resurrection and priests of the kingdom. So David, again, our deepest thanks for this lecture, for introducing us to Comenius, and for painting this beautiful picture of what education can and should be, this delighting in God, delighting in creation, and delighting in people. And I dare say, because none of us want to renounce our image of God, we will all seek to image God as best we can in caring for the creatures and the creation, in caring for one another and bringing glory to God. So thank you for a very fulsome picture of understanding education. We're grateful and we're enriched. Thank you, bless you. Would you join me in expressing our thanks to David tonight? And with that, we are done. God bless you. Have a good evening. I know that David has to teach again tomorrow, so I don't want him to have to be here too late, but I'm sure he's happy to linger for a little bit if you want to approach him with your own particular question. Thank you.